Sign it over, Mom. We need the money, my son Rashad demanded, his voice cutting through the morning stillness like a blade. He stood there in my kitchen doorway, holding crumpled papers in his fist, his eyes cold and calculating. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't have imagined in his wildest dreams, was that I had already signed it. I had already signed over our family farm, the land that had been in our bloodline for generations, the soil that held the sweat and tears of our ancestors. And I had signed it over to someone he could never escape from, someone who held power over his very livelihood. But let me pause here for just a moment. I'm so grateful you've found your way to my story today. If you're watching this, please take a second to like this video and subscribe to my channel. I want to share this journey with as many people as possible. And in the comments, tell me where you're listening to my story of revenge from. I want to know just how far this tale has traveled, because what I'm about to tell you needs to be heard. Now, let me take you back to that morning when everything changed. It was barely 5:30 a.m., and I was standing at my old wooden stove, the same one my grandmother had cooked on, preparing Rashad's favorite breakfast, buttermilk pancakes with that special vanilla and cinnamon blend I'd been making since he was 5 years old. The kitchen smelled like home, like love, like all the mornings I'd gotten up before dawn to make sure my boy had something warm in his belly before facing the world. The cast iron skillet sizzled as I poured the golden batter, watching it bubble and brown just the way he liked it. I had set the table with our good plates, the ones with the little blue flowers that had belonged to his great-grandmother, and poured fresh orange juice into the crystal glass that caught the early morning light streaming through my lace curtains. That's when Rashad burst through the back door like a storm cloud, his face twisted with that familiar look of entitlement that had been growing stronger every year. He didn't say good morning. He didn't notice the steam rising from the pancakes or the love I'd poured into every detail of his breakfast. Instead, he slammed those papers down on the table so hard that the orange juice sloshed over the rim of the crystal glass. Sign it over, Mom. We need the money, he said again, not even looking up from his phone screen as I stood there with the spatula still in my hand, my heart breaking just a little bit more. Here I was, serving him breakfast I'd been preparing since before the sun came up, and he couldn't even lift his eyes to meet mine. The contrast hit me like a physical blow. There I stood, his mother, the woman who had sacrificed everything for him, wearing my faded apron with flour still dusting my hands, while he sat in my kitchen like some kind of debt collector, demanding I sign away the very foundation of our family's legacy. He scrolled through his phone with one hand while pushing the legal documents toward me with the other, as if our ancestral land was nothing more than a commodity to be traded for his convenience. But what Rashad didn't know, what he couldn't have possibly imagined as he sat there in his designer sneakers and gold chain, was that I was already 10 steps ahead of him. And the game he thought he was playing? Well, I had already won it. To understand how we got to this moment, how my own flesh and blood could sit at my kitchen table demanding I destroy everything our family had built, you need to know the real story. You need to understand what this farm means, what it cost, and why his demand felt like watching him spit on the graves of every ancestor who had bled for this soil. This land has been in our family for 4 generations. My great-great-grandmother, Sarah May, was born into slavery on the plantation that used to border our property. When freedom came, she worked as a sharecropper for 15 brutal years, saving every penny she could scrape together while raising 6 children and nursing a husband who never recovered from the beatings he'd endured. In 1885, she bought these 40 acres with coins she'd hidden in mason jars buried beneath the floorboards of her one-room cabin. Sarah May planted the first cotton here with her bare hands, her children beside her, turning soil that had once been soaked with the tears of the enslaved into something that belonged to us. She built the original farmhouse, just 2 rooms and a lean-to kitchen, board by board, nail by nail. When the white landowners tried to intimidate her into selling, threatening to burn her out, she sat on her front porch every night with a shotgun across her lap until they finally gave up. My great-grandmother, Bertha, expanded the farm during the Depression, somehow managing to buy the adjacent 20 acres when other families were losing everything. She raised chickens and sold eggs door to door, walked 10 miles to town every Saturday to trade vegetables for supplies, and never once missed a payment on that land. During the worst of those hard times, she fed half the county with the vegetables from her garden, never turning anyone away hungry. My grandmother, Mama Rose, modernized the operation in the 1950s. She convinced the bank to loan her money for new equipment, no easy feat for a black woman in those days, and turned our farm into one of the most productive in the county. She raised 5 children here, including my father, teaching each of them that this land was more than dirt and crops. It was legacy made manifest, freedom carved out of impossible odds. My father expanded our holdings to 80 acres and built the house where Rashad and I live now. He met my mother at a church social, brought her here as his bride, and together they weathered the farm crisis of the 1980s when so many family operations went under. They held on by the skin of their teeth, taking second mortgages and working side jobs, because letting go of this land would have meant betraying every sacrifice that came before them. When I was growing up, every meal began with gratitude for the hands that had worked the soil. Every summer, I learned to plant and harvest alongside my parents, understanding that we weren't just growing crops, we were tending to a sacred trust. This farm was our independence, our security, our connection to ancestors who had transformed suffering into strength. Then I met Darius during my senior year of college, a smooth-talking charmer who swept me off my feet with promises of forever. We married young, and I brought him home to the farm, believing he would love this place the way I did. For a while, it seemed like he did. He helped with the planting seasons, learned to fix equipment, even talked about expanding our operation. But after Rashad was born, everything changed. Darius became restless, complained that farm life was too quiet, too predictable. He started staying out late, coming home with excuses that grew thinner each month. The final blow came when Rashad was barely 2 years old. I discovered Darius had been seeing one of his coworkers for months. When I confronted him, he didn't even try to deny it. "This place feels like a prison," he told me as he packed his bags. "All this history, all these expectations, I need something different." Just like that, he walked away from everything. No fight for custody, no second thoughts, no looking back. He sent child support sporadically for the first few years, then stopped altogether when he moved across the country with his new woman. So there I was, 24 years old with a toddler and 80 acres to maintain on my own. I could have sold then, Lord knows it would have been easier. But every time I looked at baby Rashad playing in the same yard where I'd grown up, where my father had grown up, where generations of our family had planted their roots, I knew giving up wasn't an option. I worked 3 jobs to keep us afloat. Mornings on the farm, afternoons at the elementary school as a teacher's aide, evenings cleaning offices in town. I drove a 15-year-old pickup truck held together with prayer and duct tape, wore the same 5 dresses to church for 3 years running, and lived on beans and rice so Rashad could have everything he needed. When Rashad played Little League, I was the only parent at every game, cheering from the bleachers in my work uniform because I'd driven straight for my shift. When he needed help with homework, I stayed up until midnight learning algebra alongside him because I was determined he would have every opportunity one could provide. I sacrificed dating, friendships, personal dreams. Everything went into raising that boy and preserving our family legacy. The farm became not just our home, but our future, the foundation that would give Rashad opportunities I'd never had. And this was how he repaid me. Sitting at my kitchen table, demanding I tear down everything our ancestors had built with their blood and sacrifice. But that morning wasn't the first time Rashad had brought up selling the farm. Over the past 6 months, what started as casual suggestions had escalated into increasingly desperate demands, and I was beginning to see a side of my son that terrified me. It began innocently enough. 3 months after he'd graduated college, with the degree I'd worked myself to the bone to pay for, Rashad moved back home, temporarily, while he figured out his next steps. Those temporary months turned into 2 years of watching him sleep until noon, scroll through his phone until midnight, and treat our home like a hotel with free meals and laundry service. "You know, Mom," he'd said one evening while I was washing the dishes he'd left piled in the sink, "you're sitting on a gold mine here." This property has got to be worth serious money now. At first, I'd laughed it off, thinking he was just making conversation. But the comments became more frequent, more pointed. He started bringing home real estate magazines, leaving them scattered around the kitchen table. He'd point out articles about farmland values, about development opportunities, about smart investments for retirement. Think about it logically, he'd argue, using that condescending tone that made my stomach clench. You're getting older, this place is too much work, and you could be living comfortably somewhere smaller with all that cash in the bank. When I tried to explain what this land meant to our family, he'd roll his eyes like I was some senile old woman clinging to the past. When I'd mention his great-great-grandmother Sarah May, he'd interrupt with complaints about how old stories weren't going to pay modern bills. The pressure intensified after I started noticing strange phone calls. Late at night, I'd hear Rashad pacing in his room, his voice low and urgent. Through the thin walls, I caught fragments that made my blood run cold. I know, but she's being stubborn about it. I heard him whisper one night around 2 a.m. The old lady doesn't understand what this opportunity means. Old lady. That's how my own son referred to me to whoever was on the other end of that call. Just give me another week, he'd pleaded. I can convince her. The property's worth at least $300,000, maybe more with the right buyer. My heart had nearly stopped. He wasn't just thinking about selling, he was actively discussing it with someone, making promises, treating our family legacy like a commodity he could negotiate. The next morning, I'd confronted him gently, asking if everything was all right, if he needed to talk about anything. But Rashad just stared at me with those cold eyes that reminded me too much of his father. Everything's fine, Mom, he'd said, but his jaw was tight, his hands clenched. Everything would be better if you'd just listen to reason about this farm situation. That's when the threats started getting more direct. He began bringing home-printed property valuations, real estate listings for comparable farmland, and paperwork from lawyers about estate planning. He'd spread them across the kitchen table like evidence in a trial, building his case for why I should sign over the deed. Look at these numbers, he'd demand, jabbing his finger at the documents. Look at what we're talking about here. You could live like a queen for the rest of your life instead of breaking your back on this old place. But it was the phone calls that truly revealed how far my son had fallen. One afternoon, while he thought I was napping, I heard him in the living room talking to someone who clearly wasn't a friend. I told you, she's old school, Rashad said, his voice carrying the edge of desperation. She's got all this sentimental attachment to the property, but I'm working on it. There was a pause, and then, No, she doesn't know about any of that. And she's not going to know, as long as you give me time to handle this the right way. My stomach dropped. What didn't I know about? What was he hiding? The money situation is temporary, he continued, and I could hear him pacing again. Once I get her to sign the papers, we can settle everything. The farm's worth way more than what I owe anyway. Oh. My son owed money to someone, and he planned to use our family land to pay his debts. I crept closer to the doorway, my heart pounding so loud I was afraid he'd hear it. Look, I've got this handled, Rashad was saying, his voice getting sharper. She raised me, all right? I know exactly which buttons to push. A little guilt about wanting to secure my future, some talk about how hard it is for her to maintain the place alone. She'll cave. The casual cruelty in his voice, the way he talked about manipulating me, his own mother, felt like daggers to my chest. This was the boy I'd sacrificed everything for, the child I'd worked 3 jobs to support, the young man I'd sent to college believing he would honor our family's legacy. Trust me, he'd finished. By the end of the month, that old farm will be history, and we'll all get what we want. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, trying to process what I'd overheard. My son wasn't just pressuring me to sell, he was plotting against me. He owed money to dangerous people, had made promises using our land as collateral, and was systematically planning to manipulate me into giving up everything our family had built. The boy who used to help me collect eggs from the henhouse, who'd learned to drive on the dirt roads between our fields, who'd grown up hearing stories about Sarah May's courage and Mama Rose's determination, that boy was gone. In his place sat a stranger who saw our ancestral land as nothing more than a solution to his gambling debts and failed schemes. But what Rashad didn't realize was that his mother hadn't raised him for 26 years without learning a thing or two about survival. And if he thought he could manipulate and threaten me into betraying 4 generations of family sacrifice, he was about to discover just how wrong he could be. The truth about how deep his betrayal ran came 3 days later, and it hit me like a physical blow to the chest. I was folding laundry in my bedroom when I heard Rashad's truck start up in the driveway. Through my window, I watched him back out and head toward town, which was strange, because he told me at lunch that he was staying in all afternoon to help around the house. In 2 years of living here, he'd never once voluntarily helped with anything, so his sudden domestic interest should have been my first warning. Something about his secretive departure didn't sit right with me. Call it mother's intuition, but after everything I'd overheard, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was connected to those mysterious phone calls and mounting pressure about the farm. 20 minutes later, I found myself driving my old pickup toward town, keeping a safe distance behind Rashad's newer truck. I felt foolish, like some suspicious wife following a cheating husband, but the knot in my stomach told me I needed to know what my son was really up to. He didn't stop at any of the usual places. Not the gas station, not the diner where he sometimes met his old high school friends, not the bank or the grocery store. Instead, he pulled into the parking lot of Morrison's restaurant, the nicest place in town, the kind of establishment where business deals were made over expensive steaks and handshakes. I parked across the street behind a delivery truck and watched Rashad walk inside like he owned the place. Through the large front windows, I could see him scanning the dining room, clearly looking for someone specific. Then he smiled, that charming smile he'd inherited from his father, and walked toward a corner booth where 2 men in expensive suits were waiting. My heart started racing. These weren't friends from high school or old college buddies. These were businessmen. And from the way they stood to shake Rashad's hand, this was clearly a planned meeting. I sat in my truck for 10 minutes, debating whether to march in there and confront him or drive home and pretend I'd never seen anything. But I couldn't leave, not when everything my family had built might be at stake. I needed to know what they were discussing. The restaurant had a side entrance that led to a small bar area adjacent to the main dining room. I'd been to Morrison's enough times over the years to know the layout, and I knew that corner booth where they were sitting was close enough to the bar that I might be able to overhear their conversation. My hands were shaking as I walked into that restaurant, but I forced myself to move with confidence. I ordered a coffee at the bar and chose a stool that put me within earshot of their table, keeping my back turned and my ears open. What I heard in the next 30 minutes destroyed every remaining illusion I had about my son. The old woman is being more stubborn than I expected, Rashad was saying, his voice carrying that same casual cruelty I'd heard during his phone calls. But she'll come around. She always does what's best for me in the end. One of the men, his voice was older, more authoritative, responded, "Time is running short, Rashad. We've already invested considerable resources based on your assurances that this property would be available." "And it will be," Rashad insisted. "Look, I know my mother. She's sentimental about the place, but she's not stupid. When I explain how much money we're talking about, she'll see reason." The second man, younger but equally businesslike, spoke up. "You understand that we've already drawn up preliminary development plans based on our site survey. We've got investors lined up, permits in process, and a construction timeline that depends on breaking ground within 60 days. My coffee cup nearly slipped from my hands. Site survey? They'd already been on our property, studying our land, making plans to destroy it? "I understand the timeline," Rashad said, and I could hear papers rustling. "And I appreciate the advance you've given me. That money solves some immediate problems, and I'm committed to delivering on our agreement." Advance money. My son had already taken payment for land he didn't own, making promises he had no right to make. $50,000 is a significant good faith investment, the older man continued. "We expect results, not excuses." $50,000. My son had taken $50,000 from these developers as some kind of down payment on our family farm. Money he'd probably already spent if his gambling debts were as serious as those late-night phone calls suggested. The beauty of this location, the younger man was saying, is the highway access combined with the scenic views. We're looking at a high-end retail complex with luxury condominiums on the upper portion of the property. The profit potential is enormous. Luxury condominiums. Retail complex. They wanted to turn Sarah May's fields, where generations of my family had planted and harvested, into some kind of shopping mall with overpriced apartments. What about environmental concerns? The older man asked. Any issues with soil contamination, wetlands, that sort of thing? Clean as a whistle, Rashad replied confidently. It's been farmland for over a century. The soil reports will be perfect for development. He was talking about our land like it was already theirs, like the sale was a done deal, like my opinion and my ownership meant absolutely nothing. And you're certain about the ownership situation? The younger man pressed. No other family members with claims, no legal complications? It's just me and my mother, Rashad said, and I could hear the dismissive shrug in his voice. She's got full ownership, but I'm her only heir. Once she signs the papers, it's a clean transfer. The casual way he spoke about my death, about inheriting everything I'd worked for, made my blood run cold. This wasn't just about pressuring me to sell. He was planning for a future where I was out of the picture entirely. Excellent, the older man said. Then we'll expect the signed documents within 2 weeks. Our legal team is prepared to expedite the closing once we have her signature. 2 weeks, Rashad agreed. I guarantee it. I left that restaurant feeling like I was walking through a nightmare. My son, the baby I'd rocked to sleep, the child I'd sacrificed everything for, the young man I'd sent to college with hopes and dreams, had sold our family's soul for 50,000 pieces of silver. He'd taken money from strangers, promised them our ancestral land, and was plotting to manipulate me into signing away everything our family had built with their blood, sweat, and tears. Worse, he was already planning for my death, treating our legacy like his personal inheritance to dispose of however he pleased. But as I drove home with tears streaming down my face, one thought kept me from completely falling apart. Rashad had made one critical mistake in all his scheming and plotting. He had no idea who he was really dealing with. That night, I sat in my kitchen, the same kitchen where Sarah May had planned her escape from sharecropping, where Mama Rose had strategized through the farm crisis, where 4 generations of strong women had faced impossible odds and found a way to survive. The weight of their legacy pressed down on my shoulders, but it also filled me with something I hadn't felt in months. Purpose. I wasn't just destiny anymore. I was the keeper of their dreams, the guardian of their sacrifice, and I'd be damned if I was going to let my ungrateful son destroy everything they'd built. As I sat there, surrounded by the ghosts of women who'd fought harder battles than this, a plan began forming in my mind. But first, I needed to tell you something that's going to change everything you think you know about the story. 3 months ago, when Rashad's pressure about selling the farm first started getting serious, I did something he never could have imagined. I didn't ignore his demands or dismiss his threats. Instead, I did exactly what he wanted. I sold the farm. But I didn't sell it to some random buyer or development company. Oh no, that would have been far too simple for what my son deserved. Instead, I sold our family land to someone who would make Rashad's life very, very interesting, his boss. You see, while Rashad was sleeping until noon and plotting against me, he was also working part-time for Marcus Thompson, a successful businessman who owned several properties around the county. Marcus ran a construction company, a small real estate operation, and had his hands in various other ventures. Rashad had been doing odd jobs for Marcus for about 6 months when he bothered showing up to work at all. What my son didn't know was that Marcus Thompson and I had history. We'd gone to high school together, dated briefly before I met Darius, and had remained friendly acquaintances over the years. Marcus was one of the few people in town who truly understood what our farm meant to our family because his grandfather had been friends with my grandfather back in the day. More importantly, Marcus was a smart businessman who recognized a good investment when he saw one. When I approached him with my proposition 3 months ago, he didn't just understand what I was trying to do. He was eager to help. The conversation happened on a Tuesday afternoon, right here in this kitchen. I'd invited Marcus over for coffee. ostensibly to discuss Rashad's work performance, but really to propose something much more significant. "Marcus," I'd said, cutting straight to the heart of the matter, "I need your help with a situation involving my son." I'd explained everything: Rashad's mounting pressure about selling the farm, his obvious financial troubles, the way he'd been treating our family legacy like a commodity to be traded. Marcus had listened with the kind of focused attention that told me he was already thinking several steps ahead. "So, what exactly are you proposing?" he'd asked, leaning back in his chair with an expression I couldn't quite read. "I want to sell you the farm," I'd said simply. "Fair market value, clean transaction, everything legal and above board, but with some very specific conditions." The conditions were elegant in their simplicity. Marcus would buy the property for exactly what it was worth, about $320,000. But instead of paying me in cash, he would hold the deed as a form of insurance policy. I would continue living here, continue maintaining the property, continue being the caretaker of our family legacy. And when the time came, when Rashad finally showed his true colors completely, Marcus would be in a position to teach my son a lesson he'd never forget. "You understand what you're asking me to do," Marcus had said, but there was already a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "I'm asking you to help me protect 4 generations of family history from someone who wants to destroy it for gambling money," I'd replied. "And I'm asking you to help teach my son that his actions have consequences." Marcus had agreed immediately. More than that, he'd refused to charge me any fees for the arrangement. "Your family has been part of this community for over a century," he'd said. "I'm honored to help preserve that legacy." The paperwork had been handled by my dear friend Virginia Patterson, the only black female lawyer in our county and someone I'd known since childhood. Virginia had grown up hearing the same stories about Sarah May and Mama Rose that I had, and she understood exactly why this arrangement was necessary. "Destiny," she'd said as we signed the documents in her office, "this is either the most brilliant thing you've ever done, or the most dangerous. But knowing your son the way I do, I'm betting on brilliant." So for the past 3 months, while Rashad had been pressuring me to sell the farm, while he'd been taking advance money from developers and making promises he couldn't keep, while he'd been treating me like some senile old woman who didn't understand business, during all of that time, the farm had already belonged to Marcus Thompson. The beautiful irony was that Rashad worked for the man who now owned our family land, and he had absolutely no idea. Every time he showed up late to work, every time he gave Marcus attitude or performed his duties half-heartedly, every time he displayed the same entitled disrespect he showed me at home, he was doing it to the man who now held power over everything Rashad thought he could manipulate me into giving him. But the most beautiful part of this arrangement was what came next. Marcus and I had agreed that when the moment was right, when Rashad had dug himself deep enough into his own grave of lies and schemes, we would reveal the truth in the most devastating way possible. Marcus knew about the developers, knew about the advance money, knew about every move Rashad was making because I kept him informed. We were just waiting for the perfect moment to spring our trap. And after what I'd witnessed at Morrison's restaurant, after hearing my son promise strangers he could deliver our family land within 2 weeks, after watching him treat our legacy like his personal piggy bank, I knew that moment had finally arrived. Tomorrow, I would call Virginia to set the final phase of our plan in motion. Tomorrow, I would give Rashad exactly what he thought he wanted, a chance to show everyone exactly who he really was. But tonight, I sat in my kitchen surrounded by the spirits of strong women who'd faced down bigger challenges than one ungrateful son, and I smiled for the first time in months. My boy thought he was playing chess while I was playing checkers. He had no idea I'd been playing an entirely different game all along. The next morning, I put my plan into motion with an Oscar-worthy performance that would have made Sarah May proud. I was making breakfast again, scrambled eggs this time, with bacon the way Rashad liked it, when he stumbled into the kitchen wearing yesterday's clothes and that entitled expression that had become his permanent mask. "Morning, son," I said sweetly, setting his plate down with just the right amount of nervous energy. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday about the farm situation." Rashad's head snapped up from his phone, his eyes suddenly sharp and focused. "Yeah? What about it?" I sighed dramatically, letting my shoulders sag like the weight of decision-making was crushing me. Maybe you're right. Maybe I am getting too old to handle this place on my own. The predatory smile that spread across his face made my stomach turn, but I kept my expression neutral, even a little defeated. "I knew you'd come around, Mom," he said, reaching across the table to pat my hand with false affection. "This is the smart choice, the practical choice." "But I need some time," I continued, pulling my hand back and wrapping it around my coffee mug like I needed the warmth. "This is a big decision, Rashad. 4 generations of family history doesn't get sold overnight." His smile faltered slightly. "How much time are we talking about here?" "A few weeks, maybe a month," I said, watching his face carefully. "I need to talk to Virginia Patterson, get some legal advice, understand my options." "A month?" The word came out sharper than he'd intended, and I could see him trying to rein in his frustration. "Mom, opportunities like this don't wait around forever. The market could change, property values could drop." I let him see a flicker of uncertainty in my eyes. "What's the rush, honey? The land isn't going anywhere." That's when the mask started slipping. Rashad's jaw tightened, and his voice took on an edge I'd heard during those late-night phone calls. "Look, I've already done some preliminary research," he said, which was a lie wrapped in truth. He'd done research, just not the kind he was admitting to. "There are people interested in this property right now, today. If we wait too long, we might miss out on the best offers." "What people?" I asked innocently. "Have you been talking to someone about selling our farm?" For just a moment, panic flashed across his features before he forced that charming smile back into place. "Just casual conversations, you know? Word gets around in a small town when prime real estate might be available." The ease with which he lied to my face was breathtaking. This was my son, the boy I'd read bedtime stories to, the child I'd bandage scraped knees for, the young man I'd cheered for at his graduation, and he was lying to me without a hint of remorse. "I suppose you're right," I said slowly. "Maybe I should at least hear what these interested parties have to say." Rashad leaned forward eagerly.
Exactly.
"Just listen to their offers, see what kind of money we're talking about. No commitment, just information." "But promise me something," I said, reaching across to touch his arm. "Promise me you won't rush me into anything. This decision affects both our futures." "Of course, Mom," he said, but his eyes were already calculating, already planning his next move. "I just want what's best for both of us." What Rashad didn't know was that his boss Marcus was playing his own role in our little drama. That very afternoon, Marcus called Rashad into his office for what appeared to be a routine work meeting. I know this because Marcus called me afterward to report on how it went, and what he told me made my skin crawl. "Your son is in deeper trouble than we thought," Marcus had said, his voice grim. "I laid out some bait today, and he took it like a starving fish." Marcus had told Rashad about a big construction project coming up that would require significant upfront investment from crew members, a sort of profit-sharing opportunity that could pay huge dividends if someone had the cash to buy in. "I made it clear that this was a limited-time opportunity," Marcus explained. "Only available to my most trusted workers, and only if they could come up with their share of the investment within the next 2 weeks." The amount Marcus had mentioned? $50,000. The exact amount Rashad had already taken from the developers. "You should have seen his face," Marcus continued. "Pure desperation. He started asking about advances on future wages, about borrowing against equipment, about any way he could get his hands on that kind of money quickly." "What did you tell him?" I asked, though I was pretty sure I already knew. "I told him I couldn't help him with loans or advances," Marcus said. "But I did mention that if he had property or assets he could liquidate quickly, that might be his best option." The beautiful cruelty of it was that Marcus was pushing Rashad toward the exact solution Rashad was already pursuing, selling the farm. But now Rashad thought he had 2 different urgent reasons to pressure me: paying off his gambling debts to dangerous people and seizing this fake investment opportunity with his boss. That evening, Rashad came home like a man possessed. Gone was any pretense of patience or understanding. He burst through the front door and immediately started spreading papers across the kitchen table: property valuations, legal documents, contact information for real estate agents. "Mom, We need to talk, he said, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. I've been thinking about what you said this morning, and I really think we need to move faster on this farm situation. Faster? I asked, feigning confusion. But this morning you agreed I should take my time with such an important decision. I know, he said, running his hands through his hair. But I've learned about some opportunities, time-sensitive opportunities, that could really benefit both of us if we act quickly. The lies were coming faster now, more desperate, more transparent. He told me about Marcus's fake investment opportunity, spinning it as a chance for us to multiply our money after selling the farm. He talked about market conditions and property values like he was some kind of expert when just months ago he couldn't balance his own checkbook. The thing is, he said, pacing around the kitchen like a caged animal, these opportunities won't wait. We're talking about a 2-week window, maybe less. 2 weeks. I let my voice rise, with what sounded like anxiety. Rashad, that's not enough time to make a decision this important. It has to be enough time, he snapped, and for a moment, the mask fell completely away. I saw the desperation there, the fear, the realization that his house of cards was starting to collapse. Then he seemed to catch himself, forcing his voice back to something resembling patience. Look, Mom, I understand this is scary, but sometimes in life, you have to take calculated risks to secure your future. Calculated risks. Like taking $50,000 from developers for property he didn't own. Like promising his boss money he didn't have for investment opportunities that didn't exist. I just need you to trust me, he said, and the pleading in his voice was real, even if everything else was lies. Have I ever steered you wrong before? I looked at my son, this stranger wearing my child's face, and felt a mixture of heartbreak and rage that threatened to overwhelm me. But I kept my voice steady, kept playing my part. All right, I said finally. Let me talk to Virginia tomorrow. If she thinks we can handle everything in 2 weeks, then maybe we can move forward. The relief that washed over Rashad's face was immediate and profound. He actually hugged me, this manipulative, lying version of my son who thought he'd just convinced his mother to save him from the consequences of his own terrible choices. But what he didn't know is that I'd already talked to Virginia. The papers were already drawn up, the plan was already in motion, and in exactly 2 weeks, my son was going to learn the hardest lesson of his life. The trap was set. Now all we had to do was wait for him to walk into it. But I didn't have to wait long. 3 days later, Rashad's desperation reached a breaking point that exceeded even my worst expectations of how far he'd fallen. I was in the garden behind the house, tending to the tomatoes that Mama Rose had planted decades ago, when I heard the sound of multiple car doors slamming in our front driveway. Through the tall corn stalks, I could see Rashad walking toward the house with the same 2 men I'd seen him meeting at Morrison's restaurant. My heart started pounding, but I forced myself to stay calm. I crept closer to the house, staying hidden behind the garden shed where I could hear everything happening on the front porch. As you can see, gentlemen, Rashad was saying in a voice I barely recognized, confident, professional, completely fake, this property has incredible potential. 80 acres of prime development land with highway access and scenic views. He was giving them a tour like he was some kind of real estate agent, like this land belonged to him instead of the man who is currently paying his wages. The existing structures are obviously dated, he continued, and I could hear their footsteps walking around the front porch. But the bones are good, and the land itself is absolutely perfect for your vision. What about zoning? The older developer asked. Any restrictions we should know about? Nothing that can't be handled, Rashad replied smoothly. My mother has already spoken with the county planning office. Everything's been pre-approved for commercial development. That was a complete lie. I'd never spoken to anyone at the planning office, and Rashad knew it. But here he was, making up stories to convince these men that our family farm was theirs for the taking. Excellent, the younger developer said. And you're certain about the timeline? Our investors are expecting to break ground within 60 days. Guaranteed, Rashad said. The paperwork will be finalized within the week. My mother is elderly and eager to get this transaction completed. Elderly and eager. As if I was some confused old woman who couldn't wait to get rid of the burden of our family legacy. I heard them walking toward the barn, and I slipped around the side of the house to keep listening. What I heard next made my blood boil. Now, about the additional acreage, Rashad was saying. I've been talking to the neighbors about potentially selling their properties as well. If you're interested in expanding the development, I might be able to facilitate those deals too. He was trying to sell our neighbors' land too? Land that didn't belong to him, to people who hadn't agreed to sell? The audacity was breathtaking. That would be ideal, the older developer said. A larger footprint would allow for Phase 2 expansion of the retail complex. Consider it done, Rashad said. I have good relationships with everyone in this area. People trust me. I had to bite my tongue to keep from laughing at that statement. If our neighbors knew what Rashad was plotting, they'd run him out of town on a rail. After about 30 minutes, I heard the developer's cars driving away. But instead of coming to find me to discuss what had just happened, Rashad went straight to his room and closed the door. Through the thin walls, I could hear him on the phone again. They loved it, he was saying to someone. The property tour went perfectly. They're ready to close as soon as I get the signed documents. There was a pause, and then, no, she doesn't suspect anything. I told them she's already approved everything through the county. By the time she realizes what's happening, it'll be too late to back out. Too late to back out. My own son was planning to trick me into signing documents I hadn't read, agreeing to terms I hadn't approved, selling land to people I'd never met. The money situation will be resolved as soon as this goes through, he continued. $50,000 to cover the advance, another $50,000 for the boss's investment opportunity, and the rest we can split according to our original agreement. Our original agreement. He'd already made deals about how to divide money from selling property that wasn't his to sell. But the real shock came when I heard him say, and don't worry about the old lady. If she gets difficult about signing, I've already prepared backup documentation that will make this whole thing legal. Backup documentation. My son was planning to forge my signature, to create false papers, to commit fraud against his own mother. I was so stunned by the depth of his betrayal that I almost missed the sound of another car pulling into our driveway. But when I looked out the window, I saw Marcus Thompson's pickup truck parking next to Rashad's vehicle. This wasn't part of our plan. Marcus wasn't supposed to be here yet. I quickly walked to the front door and opened it just as Marcus was walking up the porch steps. He looked serious, almost grim, and I knew immediately that something had changed. Afternoon, Destiny, he said, his voice carrying an edge I'd never heard before. Is Rashad here? I need to have a conversation with him. Before I could answer, Rashad appeared in the doorway behind me, his face going pale when he saw his boss standing on our front porch. Marcus, he said, trying to force that charming smile. What brings you out here? We need to talk, Marcus said, not returning the smile. About the investment opportunity we discussed, and about some other business matters that have come to my attention. I could feel the tension radiating off both men, and I knew this was the moment everything was about to explode. Maybe we should sit down, I suggested, gesturing toward the porch chairs. Can I get anyone some sweet tea? That won't be necessary, Marcus said, his eyes never leaving Rashad's face. This won't take long. Rashad was shifting from foot to foot, his hands fidgeting, clearly uncomfortable with his boss showing up unannounced. Look, Marcus, if this is about work. It's not about work, Marcus interrupted. It's about the $50,000 you told me you could have by the end of this week for the investment opportunity. Rashad's face went from pale to ashen. I'm working on that. The funding should be available very soon. Really? Marcus asked, crossing his arms. Because I just had an interesting conversation with some developers who seem to think you've already promised them this property. They also mentioned something about advance money they've given you. The silence that followed was deafening. Rashad opened and closed his mouth like a fish gasping for air, clearly trying to figure out how to explain his way out of this situation. I don't know what they told you, he finally managed, but there's obviously been some kind of misunderstanding. Marcus looked at me, then back at Rashad. The only misunderstanding here is yours, son. You seem to think you can make promises with money and property that don't belong to you. And that's when I knew it was time to end this charade once and for all. Actually, I said, stepping forward with a calm that surprised even me, I think we need to have a proper family meeting about this situation. Rashad, why don't you call those developers back? Tell them they should return this afternoon so we can discuss everything openly. Rashad looked like he'd been struck by lightning. Mom, I don't think that's necessary. Oh, but it is, I interrupted, my voice carrying the authority that 4 generations of strong women had passed down to me. And Marcus, could you stay? I think your presence would be very valuable for this conversation. Of course, Marcus said, settling into one of the porch chairs like he planned to be there for a while. And I should probably call Virginia Patterson too, I continued, pulling out my phone. Legal matters always go smoother when there's a lawyer present. The panic in Rashad's eyes was almost comical. Mom, really, we don't need lawyers and meetings. This is just a simple family discussion about our options. You're absolutely right, I said sweetly. It is a family discussion. But since you've made it so much more complicated than that, I think we need all the interested parties present. Within 2 hours, our front porch had turned into an impromptu courtroom. The developers had returned, looking confused but eager. Virginia Patterson sat at our patio table with a briefcase full of documents. Marcus remained in his chair, arms crossed, watching Rashad with the expression of a man who was about to enjoy himself immensely. And Rashad? He paced back and forth like a trapped animal, clearly trying to figure out how to control a situation that had already spun completely out of his grasp. Thank you all for coming, I began, standing at the center of our little gathering. I wanted to bring everyone together because there seems to be some confusion about the ownership and sale of this property. No confusion here, the older developer said confidently. Rashad has assured us that you're ready to finalize the sale. We have our financing in order and our development timeline approved. That's interesting, I said, looking directly at my son. Because Rashad seems to have forgotten to mention one very important detail about this farm. Rashad's face had gone completely white. Mom, please. The detail, I continued, raising my voice to cut him off, is that I already sold this farm 3 months ago. The silence that followed was absolute. I could hear birds singing in the oak trees, the distant sound of a tractor on a neighboring farm, the soft whisper of wind through the corn stalks. But from the people on my porch? Complete, stunned silence. You what? The younger developer finally managed. I sold the farm, I repeated, letting each word sink in. 3 months ago, for fair market value, in a completely legal transaction handled by Mrs. Patterson here. Virginia opened her briefcase and pulled out a stack of documents. The deed transfer was properly filed with the county recorder's office, she said in her professional lawyer voice. The new owner took possession on March 15th of this year. But that's impossible, the older developer sputtered. Rashad told us you own the property. He's been negotiating on your behalf. Rashad has been lying to you, I said simply. Just like he's been lying to me and to his boss and probably to himself. I turned to face my son, who looked like he might actually be sick. Would you like to tell them who owns the farm now, Rashad? Or should I? Please, he whispered, but I was far beyond mercy at this point. I sold our family farm to Marcus Thompson, I announced, gesturing toward the man who'd been quietly watching this entire drama unfold. The same Marcus Thompson who employs my son. The same Marcus Thompson who Rashad owes $50,000 to for a fake investment opportunity. The developers turned to stare at Marcus, who nodded grimly. That's correct. I've been the legal owner of this property for 3 months. And yes, Rashad does owe me a significant amount of money. But we gave him $50,000 as an advance payment, the younger developer said, his voice rising with panic. He said he had authorization to negotiate the sale. He lied, I said flatly. Just like he lied when he told you the county had pre-approved development permits. Just like he lied when he said I was eager to sell. Just like he's been lying about everything. Virginia pulled out a small recording device and set it on the table. In case anyone doubts the extent of these deceptions, I've been documenting some of Rashad's statements. She pressed play, and suddenly my son's voice filled the air. The old woman is being more stubborn than I expected, but she'll come around. She always does what's best for me in the end. Rashad's legs actually gave out, and he sank into the nearest chair like all the fight had drained out of him. The recording continued. I know my mother. She's sentimental about the place, but she's not stupid. When I explain how much money we're talking about, she'll see reason. And this one is particularly illuminating, Virginia said, fast-forwarding to another section. Don't worry about the old lady. If she gets difficult about signing, I've already prepared backup documentation that will make this whole thing legal. The developers were staring at Rashad like he was some kind of alien creature they'd never seen before. The older man stood up abruptly. We need to recover our advance payment immediately, he said, his voice tight with controlled anger. This constitutes fraud, misrepresentation, and possibly criminal deception. Good luck with that, Marcus said dryly. From what I understand, Rashad has already spent your money paying off gambling debts. Is that true? The younger developer demanded, turning to Rashad. Did you spend our advance payment on gambling debts? Rashad couldn't even look up from his hands. I can pay it back, he mumbled. Once we work out the details with the farm sale. There is no farm sale, I said firmly. There never was a farm sale. There was only a son who was willing to lie to anyone and everyone to get money he hadn't earned for debts he shouldn't have incurred. The developers left without another word, already discussing lawyers and lawsuits and criminal charges. Virginia packed up her documents, satisfied that justice had been properly served. And then it was just me, Marcus, and my son sitting on the porch where 4 generations of my family had made decisions about our future. So, what happens now? Rashad asked, his voice barely audible. Marcus leaned forward in his chair. Now you work for me until every penny of that debt is paid off. $50,000 to the developers, plus the $50,000 you falsely promised me for the investment opportunity, plus interest and penalties for the lies and deception. That's $100,000, Rashad said, looking up with tears in his eyes. That's right, Marcus confirmed. At your current wage, working full-time with good behavior, it should only take you about 8 years to pay it all back. 8 years. Could be longer if you keep showing up late and giving me attitude, Marcus said with a smile that held no warmth. But hey, at least you'll have job security. I looked at my son, this stranger who had tried to steal everything my family had built, and felt something I hadn't expected. Relief. The nightmare was finally over. I hope this teaches you something about consequences, I said quietly, and about respecting the people who love you. But as I watched Rashad bury his face in his hands, I realized the most important lesson of all. Sometimes the greatest act of love is refusing to enable someone's destruction, even when that someone is your own child. 7 months have passed since that day on the porch, and I want to tell you how this story truly ends, because the real resolution wasn't just about exposing lies or collecting debts. It was about what happened after the dust settled, when the consequences became reality, and when my son finally had to face the man he'd become. The legal consequences were swift and unforgiving. The developers filed criminal charges for fraud and theft, which meant Rashad faced the possibility of prison time on top of his financial obligations. Virginia Patterson worked out a plea agreement that kept him out of jail, but only because Marcus agreed to take full responsibility for collecting the debt and ensuring Rashad's rehabilitation. Your son needs to learn what work really means, Marcus told me the day after our confrontation. He needs to understand that money comes from effort, that respect is earned, and that actions have consequences that can't be talked away or charmed out of. The arrangement was strict but fair. Rashad would work for Marcus's construction company 40 hours a week at minimum wage, with every penny above basic living expenses going toward his debt. No fancy restaurants, no new clothes, no nights out gambling or drinking. He would live in a small apartment Marcus owned, drive a company truck for work only, and account for every dollar he spent. Think of it as intensive life training, Marcus had explained to Rashad, who sat silent and defeated throughout the entire conversation. You're going to learn what your mother already knows, that everything valuable in life comes from hard work and integrity. For the first few months, I wasn't sure if Rashad would stick with it. I expected him to run away, to try to skip town and avoid his responsibilities the way his father had done 24 years earlier. But something had broken in him that day on the porch. Not his spirit, but his illusions about who he was and how the world worked. The man who shows up to Marcus's job site every morning at 6 sharp is someone I barely recognize, and I mean that in the best possible way. His hands are calloused now from real work. His back is sore from carrying lumber and mixing concrete. His face is weathered from spending days in the sun doing honest labor instead of sleeping until noon and scheming about easy money. It's harder than I thought it would be, he told me during one of our monthly supervised visits. Everything hurts, and the days are so long, and there's no shortcuts to make it easier. That's what honest work feels like, I replied. That's what I did for 26 years while raising you. For the first time since he was a small child, I saw genuine shame in his eyes. Not the performative regret he'd shown when caught in lies, but real understanding of what his choices had cost. The farm itself has found new life under Marcus's ownership, though the arrangement we made ensures it remains true to its heritage. He's restored the old barn that was falling down, fixed the irrigation system that had been failing for years, and brought in modern equipment to make the operation more efficient. But he's also kept every family memorial, every historic marker, every reminder of the 4 generations who built this place with their blood and tears. This land has too much history to change its purpose, Marcus told me when we walked the property lines together last month. Your great-great-grandmother didn't fight to buy this farm, so it could become a shopping mall. She bought it to be passed down, to be preserved, to be honored. And that's exactly what's happening. Marcus has written into his will that when his time comes, the farm will transfer to a family trust managed by Virginia Patterson, ensuring it can never be sold for development or exploitation. Future generations will be able to live here, work here, and connect with their roots here, just as Sarah may always intended. But perhaps the most important change has been in my relationship with my son. Those monthly visits have become the foundation for rebuilding something that was broken long before he ever demanded I sell the farm. We talk now, really talk, about responsibility, about family, about what it means to honor the people who came before us. I used to think you were weak, Rashad admitted during our last conversation. All that talk about ancestors and legacy and sacrifice, I thought it was just sentimental nonsense that kept you from living in the real world. And now I understand that you were protecting something more valuable than money, he said quietly. You were protecting our identity, our connection to something bigger than ourselves. And I almost destroyed it for pocket change. The transformation hasn't been easy, and it's far from complete. Rashad still has 7 years of debt to work off, 7 years of proving that he's learned what responsibility really means. But for the first time since he was a teenager, I see glimpses of the good man I always hoped he could become. Some people have asked me if I'm proud of what I did, if I'm satisfied with the outcome. The truth is more complicated than pride or satisfaction. I'm relieved that our family legacy is safe. I'm grateful that my son is learning values he should have understood years ago. But I'm also heartbroken that it took such extreme measures to reach him. You know what the hardest part was? I asked Virginia during one of our recent coffee meetings. It wasn't exposing his lies or watching him face consequences. It was accepting that enabling his behavior would have been easier in the short term, but would have destroyed him in the long run. That's what real love looks like sometimes, Virginia replied. It's not about making someone happy in a moment. It's about helping them become the person they're capable of being. If you're watching this story and you recognize yourself in it, if you have someone in your life who takes your sacrifices for granted, who treats your love like a resource to be exploited rather than a gift to be treasured, then I want you to understand something important. Sometimes the greatest act of love is teaching someone they can't take your sacrifices for granted. Sometimes protecting what matters most means disappointing the people who matter most to you. And sometimes the only way to save someone from their own destruction is to let them face the consequences of their choices, no matter how much it hurts to watch. The farm is safe now, secured for generations who aren't even born yet. My son is learning what character really means. And I'm finally at peace with the knowledge that I honored both my ancestors' legacy and my responsibilities as a mother. That's worth more than all the money in the world. Did you like my story? And what city are you listening from? Let's meet in the comments. If it touched you, if it taught you something, or if it gave you strength to make hard choices in your own life, then please share it with others who might need to hear it. I'm looking forward to your comments on the story. On the screen, you can see 2 new life stories that I highly recommend. There's so much more on my channel. By the way, don't forget to subscribe. It encourages me to keep bringing more stories like this. I'll see you in the next life story. With love and respect.